Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream on the History Bible podcast. And tonight I'm joined by Dr. Dennis MacDonald. And tonight's topic is based on his book titled Feuding Gospel Authors. Apocryphal epistles clash over imitations of Homer, Euripides, and Virgil. The link to purchase the book will be in the description below and the pinned comment, along with links to many other books that Dennis has written and published. So that being said, Dennis, thank you for joining me tonight.
It's always a pleasure, Jacob. And I'm going to start with a compliment. I think you come as a host to these recordings and sessions with great questions. You've done your research. You are not judgmental about what you hear. You make these the scholarly discourse available to people in a medium that is acceptable to most of us. Even though I'm not very clever with YouTube, it really is a service. And many hosts in YouTube territory are judgmental or confrontive or not prepared, and you are not in that camp. And the people who listen to what you have to say need to understand that you're exceptional in this world of YouTube podcasts and live streams and so on. And you've got good equipment, you've got great questions, you're prepared. This is kind of your life stream right now. And I very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Dennis. I really appreciate what you said. I try the best that I can.
No, it's better than most, that's for sure.
So I'd like to start us off with this question. When you say that the gospel authors are feuding, what do you mean by that?
Well, I'm going to answer that question, but I want to talk about what motivated my production of the book. I'm basically trained as a philologian. And so my gifts have to do with ancient languages and textual criticism. And I'm not saying that I'm the best in the field, but that's what I devote my attention to. Because of that, my work is not accessible to a wider audience. Not many people are interested in the niceties of differences in Greek translations, let's say, of the Acts of Andrew. In fact, most people have not heard of the Acts of Andrew. And I think it's an absolutely marvelous project. My books have not been accessible to viewers like you have and like others have on YouTube, because discussing Greek and Latin and Coptic texts is not very acceptable. So Feuding Gospel Authors is my gift to people who want to know about the differences among the Gospels by someone who's been working on it for almost a half a century in terms that they understand. And in order to do so, I tried to give personalities to the various authors of these Gospels. And it includes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as you might imagine. It also includes the author of the Lost Gospel, Q. It includes Papias. It includes Theophilus, to whom Luke dedicated his 2 volumes, although it may be a pseudonym, and 2 different gospel authors related to the Gospel of John. And it's playful. It's a historical novel that justifies itself by a careful analysis of the texts of the Gospels themselves. The background to this, Derek, is the synopses of epic tragedy and the Gospels where I put these Gospels and Acts and John together and assess them in terms of the possible models that they inherited from the Greek tradition, especially the Homeric epics, but also Greek tragedy, Plato's Socratic dialogues, and so on. And there's so much more to say about it, but it gets so technical. And I didn't want it to be technical. I wanted it to be personal. So I gave these authors personalities, in some cases suggesting when and how they died, who their friends were, if they had children. So it's a historical novel written as a sharing of epistles with each other. And these epistles are sometimes complementary. Most of the time, they're agonistic. They're fighting with each other. So that's where the impulse comes from. It comes from a desire to personalize these authors who are so often interpreted to be conservative scribes that are just recording things that they'd heard and known and so on. No, they're human beings who are creative and they're artistic, and they are living in a world that is full of wonderful stories, especially the Homeric stories. So that's where this book comes from. Now, I can tell you where these authors disagree with each other, but that's not as important as our overarching project of giving them personalities, making sure that people understand why and how they differed from each other. So I'll give you some examples. How the Q author is astonished by the Gospel of Mark, and how Matthew thinks that Mark has really botched up the portrayal of the Gospels of the apostles. And Luke has very little time for Matthew, because Matthew is intent on the Jewish side of the Christian tradition and making Jesus's followers Torah observant. And Luke is not interested in that project. He has not only his gospel, but the Acts of the Apostles. The Gospel of John has a different agenda altogether. Now, I am a fan of all of these gospel authors. They differ from each other, but they differ from each other because they're intellectuals for their communities and they're trying to make sense of the Jesus tradition. And so that's what this book is about. Now, I have a sequel to it, Jacob, and I'm writing it right now for scholars because I want to shame them for ignoring the Homeric influence on the Gospels. And I've had to publish my own work for the last 3 volumes, including the last one, Feuding Gospel Authors, because I cannot get a publisher to validate this. Now, they're looking for a bottom line. They want to have the religious community lining up. And to talk about Homer doesn't sound like it's the thing that you're going to find out when you walk into church Sunday morning. So this has been fun for me. It is my reaching out to viewers like those that are attending to you, to make these authors human, to give them a sense of, in some cases, humor or pathos or disgust. And so it was so much fun to write. The book that I'm writing now is called How Homer Solved the Synoptic Problem. And it is an assault on gospel scholarship for having what I call Homerophobia. They're ashamed or afraid to acknowledge that the Gospels are founding myths and not historical memory. And so that's why this book's important to me. And it is not an anti-Christian document. It's actually a document that exposes the richness of the Christian discourse. Just as the Hebrew Bible, it describes the richness of the Jewish discourse. The Hebrew Bible is not one thing. It has, all these different authors, and they're competing with each other in some cases, and it makes it more exciting. So I approach these materials as a philologian, as a humanist. I'm not trying to change anybody's religion. I'm trying to enrich it. And that's what this book's about. So I can answer your question about, how one gospel author is opposing another. So I'm going to let you re-ask that question. But I think it's important to know what motivated me to write a book that I think is intended, at least from me, it is intended to make very sophisticated intertextual connections between classical literature and the Gospels, meaningful and accessible to people who are not experts. Unfortunately, the experts are not very interested in this. They've got their own agendas and they've got their own methodologies. And by the way, they are very smart and well educated. But this is a huge limitation in scholarship, and I'm glad to be perhaps a pioneer in having these things available.
What was Mark's conflict with Q?
Mark's got many conflicts with Q. The Q document portrays Jesus's associates, the 12, and identifies them as the prototypical in-group. They're the ones who are going to carry on Jesus's message. It's primarily to them that he gives his articulation of the kingdom of God. And in the end of the Q document, Jesus says he'll reward them in his kingdom with thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. The author of Mark thinks that the 12 are damaged goods. Peter denies his Lord 3 times. Judas, one of the 12, betrays Jesus. James and Jacob, the Boanerges for Mark, want to sit at Jesus's right and left hand in glory, and Jesus has nothing doing. That's reserved for martyrs. If you want to sit at my right and left hand, you've got to give your lives. And later in the tradition, they do. So that's one place where Mark is critical. Now, let's put it in I'm going to come back to that topic. But the biggest issue, Jacob, is that the Q document is written before the Jewish War. It's written around the time that Paul had been writing epistles. It's the time that Josephus had talked about in preparation before the Jewish War in 70, in the fall of Jerusalem in 70 Common Era. Mark is writing just after the war. And his readership are those who have been damaged by and terrorized by the Roman destruction of Jerusalem. And this changes the social identity of Mark's readers. So he set out to write a narrative. There was a founding myth that would glorify Jesus and make him a hero and an exemplary martyr that would make sense to Mark's readers. So it's not so much that Mark had an argument with the author of whom I call Logographos, the author of the Logos of the Logoid Jesus, or the Q document. It's rather that he's got a different readership. He has a different social identity crisis. He has a geopolitical issue. And in order to reshape the Jesus movement, he felt it obligated to challenge what had happened in Rome. And his primary goal for this, Jacob, is to challenge what he saw in Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil's Aeneid is a founding myth of the early Roman Empire and the role of Augustus. And it was the founding myth of the Roman Empire that had devastated Jerusalem. And Mark sets out quite clearly to challenge Roman hegemony, and does so in imitating the same passages in Homer that Virgil had imitated in the Aeneid. And that can't be by accident. He has these rivals that the Greeks would call the Zeleuses, where we get our word zealot. Zeleusis is a competition with different literature. And I've documented that we have dozens of times in Mark and Luke Acts where these authors are imitating Homer at the very places where Virgil did. So it's a competitive mimesis, as I would call it. And this is something that has been ignored for 2,000 years in the history of scholarship. And it's about time it ends. So the answer to your question, and I can be more explicit about it. It's what Mark has as a problem with the logo of Jesus should not be overstated, because the author imitates and adopts his narrative because of the Q document over and over again. And I can give some examples of it, although that would bore your readers. The issue is, what does one do with the Jesus tradition that was from the pre-war period, and how does one adapt it for the post-war period? And how does one reassess the relationship of the Jesus movement to Judaism? So those are the big questions that Mark is asking. And so, for example, in the Q document, there's no reference to chief priests. There's no reference to Sadducees. The issues are all Galilean. And the problems have to do with Pharisees and other so-called nomikoi, that is, people who are enforcers of Torah. And the Q document depicts Jesus as one who is trying to not get rid of the law, but to humanize it under the auspices or the rubric of the kingdom of God, which is a more compassionate way of understanding Israel's relationship to Torah. So in the Q document, those who obey every commandment of the nomos, the Torah, are called great. Not everybody can do it. Those who don't are still in the kingdom of God. What they need to do is to honor the love commandment. Love your neighbor. And that's what we find also in Paul. Now, that is not going to be enough for the author of the Gospel of Mark. Mark is going to require that the disciples and others are willing to face martyrdom and suffering, because that's what they've been suffering in the Jewish war. So there's a PTSD, in a way, in Mark that is not a part of what's going on in the Logo of Jesus. In the Q document, what I call the Q document, the Logo of Jesus, by its more original title. The Q document says that Jesus has found more faith in a centurion, a Roman centurion, than anybody in Israel. Mark cannot go there. That doesn't make any sense for him. He rewrites that story radically by using a passage or a tragedy by Sophocles, the Philoctetes. Your viewers don't want to know about that. But the issue of the relationship of the Jesus movement to Rome changes dramatically in 70 of the Common Era. And Luke is writing, my guess is somewhere 75 to 80, is a response to that. And he's writing his own founding myth for the Christian tradition to rival the founding myth of the Aeneid. And to do so, he's imitating the same passages that you find in Homer. Now, this is a seismic change in gospel scholarship. And you laid your fingers right on the biggest issue. What is Mark's problem with the Logo of Jesus? The Logo of Jesus is written, or the Q document is written by a Jew, not by a Christian, who's writing before the Jewish war and has valorized the faith of a Roman, even though there's not a Gentile mission. Mark cannot stand that. So, for example, the story of the Gerasene demoniac, the demoniac says he's possessed by his name is Legion, and he's possessed by 2,000 demons or so. Tell me that's not anti-Roman. So it's the difference is, Jacob. I'm circling around, and I'm not being very articulate. But let me put it this way: to understand the differences between the Q document, again written by a Jew before the Jewish war, with some similarities to what one finds in the Pauline epistles. The difference between that world and Mark is marked by the Jewish war. And one can say that the social identity of the Jesus movement before the war and after the war was seismically changed. So Jesus is no longer a teacher about law. Jesus now is the Christ that was promised by Jewish scriptures and an ideal martyr. The ideal in-group, no longer as in Logoi, is the 12 who are going to be promised thrones in the kingdom of God. No, the in-group are those who are willing to do the will of God, and some of the people in the 12 are not worthy of it, including James and John, who are denied the thrones. And who are the outsiders? For the Q document, the outsiders are the Pharisees and Nomikoi, that is, people in Galilee, and they fear that if they violate Torah too much, that they will be executed. Now, we don't know that this happened, but the author of the Q document is afraid of it. When you get to Mark, the Pharisees are a problem, but it's the chief priests who are the problem in Judea, the ones related to the temple. And they're the ones who were responsible for killing Jesus. That's probably the case, historically even. So you have a change in the bad guys in the Gospel of Mark. The Q document never mentions a chief priest. Mark talks about them 21 times. So it's an obsession for Mark, where it wasn't for, and I could go on and on for these differences. So the differences are not just theological. In fact, I'm not a theologian. They're sociological. They have to do with social identity, the difference in political landscape. And so I try to articulate that pretty clearly in Feuding Gospel Authors. And if you have a chance to take a look at it, I think you'll agree.
And what was Matthew's conflict with Mark?
Matthew's conflict with Mark was primarily Mark was really hard on the 12 disciples. So Peter walks off the scene in Mark as having denied Jesus 3 times, and he's weeping. He's supposed to see Jesus after the resurrection, but the women forget to tell the disciples that they're to go to see him, and Peter never gets to see his risen Lord. Now, Matthew comes along and he says, no, I'm not going to have that happen. So he gives a passage that is indebted to Mark, but expanded, where now Peter is the one who's going to be the successor of Jesus to the flock. And the disciples do go to Galilee, and they see the Lord, and Peter is going to be among the ones who are going to be prominent. Well, what about Judas Iscariot? Well, Matthew comes along and says, well, yeah, geez, Judas shouldn't have done that. But he had remorse, and he returned the silver, and he killed himself by suicide, and that should make it okay for him still to have a place in the kingdom, as Jesus had promised. And there are other places too where Matthew is a PR agent for the disciples. It really is quite amazing. And so that's one of Matthew's biggest gripes. And by the way, the family of Jesus is not handled well or positively in Mark. And Matthew has his own way of dealing with that by creating the infancy narrative, where Jesus's family is obedient and Torah observant.
And what is Luke's conflict with Matthew and Mark?
Luke's primary concern with Mark is the screwed up ending. That is, Mark ends with the failure of the women to tell the disciples to go to Galilee. Now, that's not a way for Luke to end his gospel if he's going to have the Acts of the Apostles. Instead, he sees in Matthew already that the women do tell the disciples that Jesus is risen, and they go to Galilee to get the Great Commission. Luke doesn't like that in Matthew. He wants the disciples to stay in Jerusalem until they have the power of the Holy Spirit. And then they receive the power at the beginning of Acts, and they stay in Jerusalem until they are given pressure from the Jewish community to expand their mission to Gentiles. So that's one of the problems that Luke has with both Mark and Matthew. Luke doesn't have many problems otherwise with Mark, but he has a lot with Matthew. The big issue for there is how Matthew and Luke differently deal with the Q document. Matthew is the first author of the gospel that integrates the Q document, or the logo of Jesus, in its content with Mark. And he does so in order to make the Jesus movement more conservative to Jewish nomos, to Torah. In fact, he's encouraging the community to show more Torah observance than Pharisees and others, and scribes. Luke's project is entirely different. Luke's project is to expand the Jewish movement to Gentiles, and his model for that comes out of the Pauline epistles. And so Luke is not very happy with the Torah observance that's required in Matthew, and basically he ignores Matthew unless except in the infancy narrative and the resurrection story. Why should you valorize Matthew when you've got the Q document that has earlier versions of these sayings? And why should you valorize Matthew's content and use of Matthew and use of Mark that makes the Jewish community more Torah observant, when your job, Luke, is to make the tradition more like a Pauline mission that is a mission to Gentiles. So that becomes a part of this feud between the gospel authors. So Luke has a feud with Matthew's ending, and he has a feud with he has a feud with Mark's ending, and he's a feud with Matthew's insistence on Torah observance.
What is Luke's feud with Josephus?
Well, Luke knows, apparently, and I'm not an authority on Josephus, but the work that I've seen by Steve Mason that has been accepted by many Jewish and Christian scholars is that Luke did get some of his information from Josephus. What we talked about yesterday was the Testimonium Flavianum, which is a Christian interpolation of something that Josephus almost certainly said about Jesus that was not complimentary. And I've tried to suggest what the themes were for Josephus, where he would be have such objections to Jesus and have an account for his justification for his crucifixion. The way that Steve Mason has worked is to identify places where you have historical references that appear to be more primitive in Josephus, who wrote earlier than Luke Acts, and where Luke is is using that information and botching it up, and sharing some mistakes related to it. This is brilliant detective work, And I'm in such awe of Steve Mason and other people like my friend David Levinson and his students and others to say that, yes, and by the way, a very good friend of mine was Richard Purvo, who also was adamant that Luke must have known Luke X. Now, if he did, I can't imagine that Luke would not have been interested in what Josephus had to say about Jesus that was then corrected by the Testimonium Flavianum by someone else. And that piece itself has Lucan elements, as other people have noted. The last chapter of the Gospel of Luke has all kinds of vocabulary and commitments theologically that appear in the Testimonium Flavianum, such that one would be tempted to say, and I'm not going to say it, that Luke himself was responsible for the Testimonium Flavianum. But I am willing to say that whoever did it may well have been imitating or at least schooled by what he or she saw at the end of the Gospel of Luke.
How do Mark and Luke use Homer differently?
This is a very complex topic, as you know, Jacob. Let's start with Mark. Mark is invested in creating a founding myth to challenge Virgil's Aeneid, the Roman founding myth, by imitating the same Homeric elements, and to make Jesus more virtuous than Odysseus and Hector and Achilles, but also more virtuous than Aeneas. Luke has that same objective, but Luke's objective extends far beyond it. In fact, Luke includes most of Mark's imitations of Homer, but he explodes it in the Acts of the Apostles. And not only that, but he has imitations of Socrates, according to Plato's Phaedo and Apology especially, and to some extent the Republic. He also expands it by using the Homeric hymns to Aphrodite and Dionysus. He expands it especially with Euripides' Bacchae to portray Jesus as, Paul as a new Dionysus and not just a new Socrates. And so Luke's mission for expanding his Homeric imitations has to do with the extension of the Christian story. Now, it's particularly lamentable, in my view, Jacob, that there are recent commentaries on the Acts of the Apostles that insist on its historical veracity. That is so damn stupid. I don't know what to say about it. That's just ignorant. These people don't know classical literature, and they are so far behind the intelligence of Luke that it really is shameful. The Acts of the Apostles, from beginning to end, is a magnificent rewriting of classical literature. And so it takes Mark's project and elaborates it to help narrate the founding myth of the Jewish, of the Christian message up to the imprisonment of Paul. And I tried to document this over and over again and people still have homerophobia about it. But so the differences are not in terms of methodology between Mark and Luke. They're between the extension of the Christian narrative by continuing to compare the movement after Jesus, especially with Peter and Paul, by using images that are available to the Greek classical corpus. So the difference is an extension. It's not in methodology.
He tells about Luke's feud with the Dionysian redactor.
I'm going to have to change the question, because I don't think Luke knew about the Dionysian redactor. Although I say that in the book, but I put it on the lips, for the most part, of Theophilus, who is the one who has to deal with the Dionysian gospel. But that's not exactly fair. So let's say that Luke was aware of the Dionysian gospel. And that's what I say in the book. So let me back off from what I just said. What I say in the book is that Theophilus, because he's a wealthy Roman, comes across a book in which Jesus is portrayed as a new Dionysus. And this is the first edition of the Gospel of John, which I call the Dionysian Gospel. That's why you have the first miracle that Jesus produces to be the changing of water into wine. Now, Theophilus gives a copy of that to Luke. Oops, I have an Amber Alert here, I think. So he gives that to Luke, and Luke says, hey, this author is imitating what he saw in the Acts of the Apostles. He's got several passages in which he's imitating me and doesn't give me credit for it. And he's taking these tropes and applying them to Jesus, which I'd applied earlier to Peter or to Paul. Now, that doesn't seem very fair. And I want to know why he's doing it. Obviously, he's not writing a history. If he were writing a history, he wouldn't be imitating my stuff and what I wrote in the Acts of the Apostles. So he really gives a broadside against this Dionysian gospel. The author of the Dionysian gospel comes back and says, hey, wait. I'm not trying to outdo you. I'm trying to supplement you. And let me tell you why. Your gospel and others portray Jesus as someone who's demanding that they take up their cross, that they sell their goods, that they give to the poor, that they wait for treasure in heaven by abandoning treasure on earth. And the author says, hey, listen, I'm living in Western Asia Minor, and we have Dionysian initiates all over the place who are saying that the Dionysus offers wine, offers eternal life, offers good sex, and a relationship to women that is unusual. And I'm going to write an appendix to what you've written and you other gospel authors have written that says that Jesus is the giver of one gift after another as well. Instead of casting out a demon at the beginning of the Gospel of Mark, I'm going to have Jesus making lots of wine at a wedding when people are already drunk. Take that. I'm also going to talk about Jesus supplying water, a living water to a woman outside the city, very much like Dionysius did to the Maenads. I'm going to have Lazarus rescued from his tomb in a way that is very similar to how Dionysius was rescued from the palace of Pentheus, or the prison of Pentheus. So then in my book, Luke writes this author and he says, actually, I apologize. It seemed to me that you were trying to outdo what we had written. What you're trying to do is augment it, and to say that Jesus not only is demanding of discipleship, but is also offering gifts. And so he makes nice about it. So I hope that's a livable answer to your question. By the way, I think this is wonderful for you to ask these questions, because I think it gets to the core of what Feuding Gospels are about. These authors are differing from each other because they have different social locations and different commitments, and they see shortcomings in other Gospels that they respect but want to augment. And that's what's going on in the Dionysian Gospel. The Dionysian Gospel is trying to correct the difficult discipleship requirements of the Synoptics, which is really quite obvious, and to bring a little joy to the Christian community.
Can you tell us about the beloved disciples' detente with Luke?
This is how my book ends. The Gospel of John is written, it would appear, in at least 3 different compositional moments. The last one is the one where we find references to the so-called beloved disciple, who likely is the elder John, not the son of Zebedee. And you can see how this works because the epilogue, chapter 21, has its own epilogue. Chapter 20 has its own epilogue. And all of a sudden in chapter 21, we find this business about the miraculous catch of fish, and Peter being designated as the shepherd of Jesus's flock, and his concern that a promise that John would never die before the return of Jesus, and so on. So, but what you're after is a congenial conclusion. And this is the postscript of the epilogue. It's the very end of the gospel, and it's a brilliant, brilliant statement. The world may never be able to absorb all the writings that might be written about Jesus. The author is acknowledging the plurality of gospel composition. The author knows of other synoptic gospels, of the synoptic gospels, and maybe stages of his own gospel. But the one that is written by the beloved disciple is the one that we cherish. So that there's a detente of there's a recognition of the validity of other gospels. And there's pride in the gospel that is identified with the beloved disciple. And so, whereas my book is about feuding gospels and feuding gospel authors, we find a detente at the end of the Gospel of John that says, okay, there are these feuds, and we're going to hold to the one that we value most because it speaks to our social identity. By the way, I mentioned social identity several times in this interview. That really is much more important than theology. To understand why these people are trying to recraft the teachings of Jesus out of a Jewish and a Gentile context by using the literary resources available to them. And in the end, with the Gospel of John at least, a recognition of the pluralism and diversity of the Christian message and pride in their own social identity shaping narrative. And I'm so glad you brought it up as you did, as the conclusion of the book in a way.
And my final question, could you tell us about Marcion's feud with Luke?
In an earlier version of this book, I actually had two more important sections. One was on the Gospel of Thomas and its use of the Synoptics, and the other was on Marcion's Evangelion. I doubt that many of your viewers would know about Marcion's Evangelion or his Apostolicon, which is his second volume, which is the replacement for the Acts of the Apostles, so it would appear. Some scholars have argued that Marcion's Evangelion is the earliest of the Gospels because it is shorter and because it, for a number of reasons, although its reconstruction is very difficult, though people have done a wonderful job in reconstructing it. And they've hoped in some cases to say that it's a substitute for Q. That really doesn't work. And I'll tell you why. And I think this is the core of the question that you're asking. If one grants the widespread imitation of Homer, especially in Mark, but to some extent also in Luke, it is clear that Matthew and Luke have the earlier version of the Homeric epics in mind. Because when these stories get retold in Marcion's Evangelion, they're much shorter. They don't include the Homeric epics. So then you have to make a decision. Are you going to have two layers of composition that are imitating Homer? One that is pretty sloppy and episodic, or another later that is more beautiful and extensive and so on? Or can you just say that Mark and Luke were the earliest versions and Marcion came along and botched it up? Either he or the scribes who were involved in the creation of the Evangelion. So I think the Homeric solution to the synoptic problem answers the problem of Marcion's gospel, that it's a later truncation of Luke's gospel. It ignores Mark and Matthew, and its Homeric imitations survive only in truncated versions, and it just doesn't make any sense. Let me say that I do know of at least one scholar who has attempted to harmonize mimicist criticism and imitations of Homer with the Marcion Evangelion in its parallels. And I must say it's been a huge failure, and I'm sorry about that. He's actually a friend of mine.
And I'd like to remind everybody that the link to purchase Feuding Gospel Offers will be in the description below and in the pinned comment, along with many other books that Dennis has written and published. With that being said, Dennis, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Well, thank you, Jacob. It's always a pleasure to be able to talk about these things.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.